Hi, and welcome to this full-on beginner Unity tutorial. In the previous tutorial, we made it so that a bunch of enemies spawned and chased the player around. In this episode, we are actually going to give the player an objective, which is to eat all of the yummy cheese cubes in the scene so that the gate opens so that the player can go through the gate. The timestamps are listed down in the description, so here we go. We are starting right where we left off. In the previous episode, we made it so that the player can reach the yummy cheese cube and have enemies spawn into the scene and chase the player down. And when the player reaches the yummy cheese cube, the scene restarts, enabling the player to add in new levels. But just having the enemy chasing the player while it goes from point A to point B is kind of boring. What if we want the player to go from point A to point B while picking up items and having to reach a certain point count in order to leave? So here's what I'm talking about. So I have real quickly gone ahead and modified the scene just a little bit. We have duplicated the yummy cubes and have put a whole bunch of them all over the map. And also I made them just a little bit smaller just because the original one I believe was a little bit too big. And also I made a new ground plane here, as well as I made this little gate right here. Now this gate is blocked by this wooden board right here. And here's what the goal is going to be. The player has to eat all of the yummy cheese cubes to get through the gate. So this board is going to disappear when the player eats all of the yummy cheese cubes. Now the player is going to have to do this with all of the enemies chasing the player down. So this is what we are going to try to program in this game. We're also going to visualize how many cheese cubes the player has eaten by having a canvas UI up here with a number showing exactly how many the player needs to eat before the gate disappears. So let's go on and do that. So right now we have the yummy cheese cubes right here. If we were to click on them and go into the inspector, we have the cheese cube script. Now we made this script in the previous video so that when the player runs into it, the scene will basically reload and start all over. But as you can see, we don't want that because now the player is trying to eat all of the yummy cheese cubes to get through this gate right here. So we're going to have to adjust this script right here so that we can do that. So we are going to hit the three dots right here, click on it, and click on Edit Script, and that will open up Visual Studio. So let's see what's in the cheese cube script. So we have a private void on trigger enter collider other if other.compare tag equals player scene manager.load scene sample scene. So what we wrote in the script is when the player enters the cheese cube, it will reload the scene. Now, we don't need to change very much about this script right here, but we are going to have to change a couple of things in this episode. So let's get rid of the scene manager.load scene sample scene. We don't want to be loading the scene anymore. We just want to either increase in points or to change the UI that we're going to put in to decrease by 1 as the player eats the cheese cube. Now, how are we going to keep track of how many cheese cubes the player has eaten? Well, I think we're going to have to put a new variable on the player script because we are going to want the player itself to track how many cheese cubes it has eaten. So let's also open up the player script. So I'm going to minimize Visual Studio and let's navigate over to the player. So let's left click on the player, search for the player script. In this case, the script is going to be called rolling ball. So this is our rolling ball script right here, and we just want to make a new public variable to represent how many cheese cubes the player has eaten. So let's say public int, and let's say cheese cubes eaten, and we are going to start that off at 0. Now we don't have to do anything else in the script at the moment, but all we have right now is this public integer, and because it's public, we can access this through any other script. So we're going to go directly back to the cheese cube script, and let's grab the cheese cubes eaten variable from rolling ball. So in this if statement that we already wrote, we already know that we are dealing with the player. So because we are dealing with the player, we know that we can get the rolling ball script, this one, from the player. How do we do that? We do it by using something called getComponent. GetComponent is really, really powerful when it comes to Unity. I would highly recommend checking out the documentation for that, but I will give you a brief explanation of what getComponent is. GetComponent allows you to, is pretty self-explanatory, get any component from an object. This includes anything from a script, to a box collider, to a rigid body, to a nav mesh agent, animation controller, pretty much anything that Unity has in the game. So let's use this to our advantage. We are going to say other.getComponent. So we type in getComponent, and then we type in these little sideways arrows here. And inside these sideways arrows, we have to put in the name of the component. In this case, the name of the component will be rolling ball. So now we type in a pair of parentheses, dot. So now that we've typed in dot, we can get anything we want from the rolling ball script. So what do we need? We need to get cheese cubes eaten. So we would type in cheese cubes eaten, and it should autofill it in for you. If it doesn't, then you need to make sure that you have assembly C# enabled here. So we have dot cheese cubes eaten. Now we have gotten this integer. What do we do with it? Well, we just have to add 1 to it, right? Because the player has eaten the cheese cube, and now we can tell the player that it has eaten 1 more cheese cube than it did in the previous frame. So we would just simply say plus plus. So what's going on with the script? When the player enters the trigger of the cheese cube, it will detect if the player is actually the player, and if it is, it will get the rolling ball component, and it'll get the cheese cubes eaten variable, and it will add 1 to the variable itself. Okay, so I'm going to save that. And also one more thing that we need to do is we need to destroy the cheese cube when the player runs into it, because the player has eaten it, and when the player has eaten it, then we need to make sure that the cheese cube disappears, because then the player could just keep running into it and keep, eating off of it, and we don't want that. So we are going to say destroy game object. Now make sure this is a capital, or not a capital, make sure this is a lowercase g right here, because if you were to put in uppercase G, this references the entire game object class, and that just wouldn't work. So be sure to use a lowercase g. I'm going to put a semicolon there. Let's hit save, and let's see what happens. We also don't need Unity engine.scene management, so I'm going to get rid of that because we are not editing any scenes. So let's save it, minimize it, and let's see what happens, shall we? So we are going to hit play. Okay, let's see what happens. So real quickly, let's just pause. What is going on with the player right now? If we were to click on the player and go into the rolling ball script, you can see that cheese cubes eaten is currently set to 0. What happens if I were to eat one of the cheese cubes or run into it? Okay, so let's just get out of the way real quickly. If I were to hit pause, we just ran into one of the cheese cubes. As you can see, cheese cubes eaten is now set to 1, which means that the cheese cube script added 1 to the amount of cheese cubes eaten that the player has eaten. Okay, now let's try to eat this one too. Okay, well, let's see if that worked. So if we were to hit pause and we were to click on the player, aha. So here's another thing. Cheese cubes eaten is now equal to 0, right? But the player ate 2 cheese cubes. What happened? Well, when the player ran into this enemy right here, the enemy made the player restart the scene, right? So the player's cheese cubes eaten variable is currently set to 0 and not 2 because the scene restarted. So it doesn't save it, right? It's only saved in memory for the current scene. So it already does the work for us. It sets it back to 0 when the scene restarts. But if I were to eat 2 cheese cubes, or try to eat 2 cheese cubes, there we go. Okay, so now if I were to hit pause, the player's cheese cubes eaten is now 2 until the scene restarts or until we change it manually. Now, you might be wondering, why do we have to store the cheese cubes eaten into a variable? Why can't we do some sort of easier method? Well, we need a way to track how many cheese cubes the player has eaten in order to open this gate right here. Here's what we are going to do. We are going to edit the player script so that when the player has eaten all of the cheese cubes here, the gate will open, okay? So here's what we're going to do. We are going to modify the rolling ball script to make it so that when the player has eaten 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cheese cubes in this case. It could be different for your case, but in this case there are 8 cheese cubes. When the player has eaten 8 cheese cubes, this gate right here will disappear and the player can roll on through. So we are going to modify the rolling ball script in order to do that. So we are back in Visual Studio and we need to make it so that when the player eats 8 cheese cubes, the gate will open. So we currently have this public int cheese cubes eaten equals 0, and this number changes based on how many the player has eaten. Now, we need to define a threshold for how many cheese cubes the player can eat in order for the gate to open. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to say public int, and let's say cheese cube threshold. So for this case, we are going to say 8. And once again, this can change based on how many you want, but we have made this a public integer so that we can change this in the inspector however we want. So we have this cheese cube threshold equals 8. Now, this should be pretty simple math. We basically just have to detect if the cheese cubes eaten variable is greater than or equal to cheese cube threshold variable. Now, you would think to do this in the update method because we want to check every single frame, but actually we are going to do this in a different method, and I will show you why in a second. So this is actually pretty good practice for making a new method. I don't think we've done this in a tutorial before, but we are going to make a brand new method that will enable the player to check if cheese cubes eaten is greater than or equal to cheese cube threshold. So we are going to say public void, and then let's give it a name, check threshold. There we go, pair of parentheses, curly braces. Okay, so this is the method that we are going to use to check if cheese cubes eaten is greater than or equal to cheese cube threshold. And once again, we're not putting this in update because we don't want to check this every single frame, because if we check it every frame, the game might run a little bit more slowly. So all we have to do in this method is run an if statement. So we are going to say if cheese cubes eaten is greater than or equal to cheese cube threshold, curly braces. Now I'm putting the greater than just in case something happens where the player eats more cheese cubes than it's supposed to. That's usually not supposed to happen, but just in case, I have it covered. But anyways, if the player eats all of the cheese cubes, then this if statement will run if check threshold is called. Now, what do we need to do inside this if statement? We need to open the gate, like we said we were going to do, because remember, as we said, when the player eats all of the cheese cubes, the gate is going to open. So in this case, we just need to disable the gate game object. Now in this case, we need the gate game object reference up here. So I'm going to say public game object gate. And this is a variable that we can assign in the inspector later on. Now I'm going to say gate dot set active and then false. There we go. So when this method is called, check threshold, the player is going to disable the gate when it has eaten all of the cheese cubes. Now, how do we call this method? Once again, we can call it in the update method, we can essentially call it anywhere we want. But when do we want to check on it? We don't want to check on it every frame because then the game will run slower. We only want to check whenever the player has eaten a cheese cube, and we've essentially already written that code. So we can go into the cheese cube script and see what we have here. As you can see, the code is pretty much already written, because if the player runs into a cheese cube, this code will run here. Cheese cubes eaten will be incremented by 1, and essentially we just have to call the method of the rolling ball script, this one right here, from the cheese cube script, and that's all that we have to do. So in this case, we are going to say other.getComponent rolling ball parentheses dot. This line is essentially the same as the line above it, except in this case we are going to type check threshold. Okay, so we have now called this method from this, or no, we have now called the check threshold method from the cheese cube script. Awesome. So now let's go back into Unity and see what happens. So we are back in the scene here, and as you can see right off the bat, I actually reduced the yummy cheese cube counts to 4 instead of 8. Now I did that just to make the demonstration quicker so that the player doesn't have to eat all 8 yummy cheese cubes in order to win, but also there is a problem here, and this is good for demonstration purposes. Because I deleted 4 of the yummy cheese cubes, the player now only needs to eat 4 to get through the gate. However, if we were to go into the script here, we can see that we set the threshold here to 8. Now, we can change this to 4 and fix that problem. So I'm just going to change that to 4, and there we go. So now the player only has to eat 4 in order for this to work. Now, right now, as you can see, the gate is set to none, so we have to grab the gate from the scene and drag it in here. Now, all we have to do is click on the gate here. Here's the gate, and we can see that this is the gate's game object right here. It's basically whatever game object that you have right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the player again, and then click on the gate, and then drag it over to the gate game object. And now the player should be able to reference the gate. So let's actually play this scene and see what happens. So I'm going to hit play and keep looking at the rolling ball scripts to see what happens. Right now, cheese cubes eaten equals 1, and I have to figure out how to get around these enemies. Yeah, there we go. Oh no, the scene restarted. Okay, so we know that that works. Let me speed this up so that this isn't as long for you. Okay, so we're about to eat the 3rd and 4th one. Let me just bring out the script again. So we've eaten 2, and we're about to eat a 3rd one, and voila! As you can see, the gate has now been opened. Awesome. That's amazing. So now the player is able to roll on through. Alright, great. So we have made it so that when the player eats all of the yummy cheese cubes within the scene, the gate will open and the player can go on through. Now, one thing to demonstrate is if you try to go through the gate before the cheese cubes are eaten, let me just get there real quickly. So if I try to go through the gate without the gate being disabled, the player cannot go through it because the gate has physics enabled and it has a collider, and the player would just run right into it. So there we go. We now have it so that when the player eats all of the cheese cubes in the level, the gate will open and the player can roll on through. That is awesome. But what if we have a whole bunch of cheese cubes in the script? Let's just say for a future level, we want to see exactly how many we've eaten and exactly how many we have left to eat. Well, that is where UI comes into place. We can display a number anywhere on the screen, so let's say up on the top left-hand corner, we can display a number showing how many we've eaten and how many we have left to eat in order for the gate to open. So let's set that up. First though, let me organize some things in the hierarchy right here, because as you can see, we just have a whole mess of objects and there's really no organization. And as you know, I love to be organized when I make games. So we can organize these things into certain folders that correspond to their type. So for example, I could put all of the yummy cheese cubes in the folder. I could put all of the enemies in, well actually there are no enemies yet because we have to spawn them in. I could put all of the spawn pads though in a certain folder. So let's go do that. I'm going to right click in the hierarchy window and then select create empty, and this will make an empty game object, and let's call this yummy cheese cubes. And I'm just going to select every single yummy cheese cube. So I'm going to left click and then hit Control left click on every single one. And I'm going to click on them and then drag. So holding on to the left mouse button, I'm going to drag them all into the yummy cheese cubes game object. So now we can collapse that. And as you can see, all of the yummy cheese cubes are now collected in this one yummy cheese cubes game object. And the game object doesn't really mean anything. However, I could move them all around if I want to, but I'm not going to do that for this. Now, what is this? We have a plane. Okay, so this is the second grounds that I put in here. And this plane, I'm guessing, is the first one. Yes, it is. So I'm going to make a new game object, an empty game object called ground, I guess. And then let's put both of those green grounds into the ground game object. So there we go. So we now have all of it collected into one object. What else do we need? Let's do the same thing for spawn pads. So I'm going to right click and then say create empty. And then let's say spawn pads. And let's do the same thing. Click, control click, drag into spawn pads. Now, we already have the same thing for trash cans and walls, the player, main camera, and directional light. Actually, I'm going to make a folder for other. I'll say other, and this is just for miscellaneous stuff like the camera and the directional light. I'm going to drag that in there. And actually, we can organize this even further because the walls, the ground, and the spawn pads are all part of the environment. So I can right click, hit create empty, and actually for this case I'll call it level because the walls, the ground, the spawn pads, the trash cans, they're all part of the current level. So I'm going to select the ground, the walls, the trash cans, and the spawn pads, and I'm going to put it into the level. And also, while we're at it, let's also do it for the yummy cheese cubes. So there we go. We have level, other, and player. And when we expand it, we can get into any game object we want. And of course, obviously, if we were to just select any game object in the scene, it will open it up automatically. So there we go. That is what we have for organization. Now, I'm trying to be organized because we are about to add some more things to the hierarchy, which is going to be the UI canvas that we are going to use for putting a number onto the screen for how many cubes the player has eaten and how many cubes the player needs to eat. I'm going to hit Control S to save the scene, and let's go on and do that. Now, in order to display UI onto the screen, we need a special game object from the hierarchy called a canvas. So let's go on and create that. I'm going to right click and then go over to UI and then go over to canvas. And this creates this giant box here, like a huge box here, for displaying the UI. So all of the UI is going to be displayed on this box, which will eventually also be displayed on the screen right here in the game view. However, we do need to adjust the canvas so that the UI fits properly. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it's kind of complicated, but I will try to explain it the best that I can. Basically, the canvas has to adjust to whatever screen size you have on your computer. Now, the only problem with that is that when you build your game and do a whole bunch of stuff with it, like release it and sell it, the other people who will be playing your game may not necessarily have the same size screen as you, and the canvas doesn't know that right off the bat. So if we have the canvas object selected, we need to go into the inspector and change something in the canvas scaler, because the canvas scaler is meant for scaling the canvas with whatever screen size you have. So in the UI scale mode, I'm going to go to constant pixel size, I'm going to click, and I'm going to click on scale with screen size. Now what happens if we change this to scale with screen size? Well, let's find out. We are going to make some test objects to test out where we want our UI. Now, here's the thing with the canvas. Everything in terms of UI has to be a child of the canvas, which means it has to be inside the canvas. So For example, in level, all of these objects are children of the level game object. Every piece of UI has to be a child of canvas, so you can't make a text UI outside of the canvas. It has to be in the canvas itself. So we are going to do that. Let's go make a new UI element. We're going to right click on the canvas itself, hover over to UI, and then select text in this case. Now as you can see, we have new text that is showing up right here, and in the game view, we see new text showing up right there. Now, if I were to drag this over to the top left-hand corner of our giant box here, as you can see, new text is also being dragged up to the top left-hand corner here. Now what happens if I were to go over to the canvas itself and change the UI scale mode back to constant pixel size? Now, it gets a lot smaller, and that's because my monitor is 2560 by 1440, so it is going by the actual pixels on my monitor. Your monitor might be different. It might be a 4K monitor, it might be a 1080p monitor. We have no idea, so that's why we have to change this to scale with screen size so that it's the same exact scale no matter what screen you are working with. One thing that I forgot to mention in the tutorial was how to align your game view to match your screen size, because right now I have a custom screen size for the game view, which I just have called Big Monitor. For most people, I would suggest clicking on 16:9, and this will give you the 16:9 aspect ratio that most computer screens have. I hope that this was helpful, and on with the regular tutorial. Okay, so we have our new text right here. Now we can change this up. If we go into the text component of the inspector of the text game object, we can change the text of the text. So we could say, hello world. That's something that everybody types. Let's say, hello fellow game developers. Aha. So notice how I typed in hello fellow game developers, but it only shows hello fellow game, and it cut out the word developers. Well, that's because the text object isn't big enough to fit all of the words. We can change that though. If we were to go up to these tools up here, right here, and we were to click on this one, the rect tool, there are these 4 blue corners that show up on the text game object. All we have to do is scale the corners so that it's big enough to fit the size of the text. And as you can see, it is now big enough. And on the screen, we now see, hello, fellow game developers. Now, it's a bit dark for a bit of a brown background, so we can also change the color here, right here, and we can just click on it, left click, and we can change the color to white. We have this little color picker here, so we can just change it to white, and it'll change it to white here. Another thing that I love doing with text is adding a shadow, because right now it's just white and there's no contrasting color behind it to make it stand out more. So in the text game object, in the inspector, we can go to add component and add a shadow. So if I were to type out shadow, now as you can see, it adds a shadow behind the text and it makes it a little bit easier to read. And we can mess around with the effect distance, but right now I think it looks pretty good. So it says, hello fellow game developers. Awesome, but that's not exactly what we want. Let's prototype out exactly what we want. So previously I said that we are going to add a number for how many cheese cubes the player has eaten and how many cheese cubes the player needs to eat. So let's test this out. Let's say cheese cubes eaten, and let's just put a number 99 just to accommodate for very large numbers in the future if you need to have numbers like that. And let's hit enter. Oops, I capitalized the U in cheese cubes. There we go. Let's hit enter, and let's say cheese cubes needed, or cheese cubes remaining. There we go. So I don't know, let's just say 12. There we go. So Now we have the prototype of the text that we need. Now, how can we make this look a little bit better? Well, we can actually increase the font size a little bit. Let's see. Let's try increasing this to 20. Now, as you can see, the text is now bigger, so we would have to increase the scale of the rect. So let's drag these little boxes here. And there we go. Okay, so it does overlap a little bit with the actual scene here, but we can adjust that later. Let's actually change this to just cubes eaten and cubes remaining, because we already know that they are cheese cubes, so we don't have to say cheese cubes, we just say cubes. So there we go. Cubes eaten 99, cubes remaining 12. Now, obviously, we're not going to always use the numbers 99, and we're not always going to use the number 12. We have to change the numbers to exactly what we want. So we are going to go back into the script, and we are going to adjust these numbers using the player script itself. And it's actually really easy. Let me show you exactly how it works. So we are going to go back into the rolling ball script, going to click on the three dots and click on Edit Script. So that brings us back to the rolling ball script. Okay, so here we go. We have to reference the canvas UI, in this case, the text element. We have to reference the text element so that we can change the number itself, okay? So we need to import a new library for this, because by default in C#, we don't know how to access specific Unity UI elements. So we are going to type here using Unity engine.ui, and this will import the UI library that we need to reference the text, which is exactly what we are going to do right now. In our variable blob right here, we're going to add a new variable. So we are going to say public text, and let's say progress UI, because it shows the progress of how many the player has eaten, right? And we are going to assign this in the inspector when we go back to the game. So what do we do now? We need to update the text whenever the player eats cheese cubes. First, though, we have to do it in the start method. So in the start method, we have to say cheese cubes remaining will be however much the cheese cube threshold is, and cheese cubes eaten has to be 0 because the player hasn't eaten any yet. So we are going to say progress UI.text equals. This is where we enter in a string. So I'm going to hit parentheses right here, or not parentheses, quotes. Let's add a semicolon. Now we're going to save this. This isn't what we want yet, but I'm going to minimize this and go back into the canvas and see exactly what we wrote here so that we have a reference. So we went back into the text, and I'm actually going to change this to progress text. There we go. And while we're at it, let's just assign that to the script itself. So I'm going to click on player, and in progress UI, let's drag progress text into progress UI. So there we go. We have now referenced the text. And let's just select this entire string right here, and let's hit Control-C to copy it. And then let's go back into the script and paste it. Okay, so let's go back to Edit Script. And there it is. In the start method, we are going to go into the quotes there and hit Control-V to paste. All right, so what do we have going on right here? Well, let's bring this back up to one line. There we go. So we have cubes eaten, 99, cubes remaining, 12. First off, the script thinks that this is all one line, so it's going to just put this all into one line. We need to make it so that it knows when to go onto a new line, and we can do that by hitting /n. /n tells the script, okay, right after the 9 here, I want you to make a new line, and from then on, cubes remaining, 12, will be on the new line. Now we just need to change this number, okay? So let's say cubes eaten equals 0, because it's always going to be 0. when the player starts the level. Of course, unless you want to save your progress, but that's a little bit more complicated. However, cubes remaining is going to be different. We need to set cubes remaining to the cheese cube threshold, because the cheese cube threshold is how many cheese cubes are in the level in order for the player to open the gate. So I'm going to add this variable here by getting rid of the 12 and hitting the plus key and then typing in cheese cube threshold. Now what this is going to do is this is going to put this number, the number 8 in this case, right after the colon right here. Now we want a space there so that we have a space there just for consistency because there's a space here. And this will actually put the number, cheese cube threshold, right onto the text there. Now we actually have to copy this. And how often do we want to update the actual string of the text? We want to update it every single time we eat a cheese cube. How do we do that? Well, remember back when we wrote the check threshold method here? We called this method every time a cheese cube was eaten. So we actually already have the code written already. So we just have to copy and then just paste it in the check threshold method here. And the code is already written for us. Now we do need to change this number right here, okay? And we have to change this to cheese cubes eaten. So we have to say, well no, actually we have to add in a quote here to end the string, and then hit plus, and then we have to say cheese cubes eaten, and then we say another plus, and then we have to put in another quote right there, and this is going to work. So it's going to say cubes eaten, space, cheese cubes eaten, and then cubes remaining. Now this number needs to change because it's not always going to be 8, right? So in this case we need to say cheese cube threshold minus cheese cubes eaten. So in this case, if we have a variable for cheese cube threshold at 8, and let's say we have eaten 4 of them already, we would want this number to be 4 because 8 minus 4 equals 4. Now this gave us an error. That's because we have to put a set of parentheses in here, and there we go. This should work right off the bat. So let's test this out and see what happens. So I've just hit play, and as you can see, cubes remaining equals 4. If I were to eat a cheese cube, cubes eaten would equal 1, and cubes remaining would equal 3. There we go. And let's just continue on through this level and make sure that it works as expected. So if I were to eat this, cubes eaten equals 2, cubes remaining equals 2, cubes eaten equals 3, cubes remaining equals 1, and let's eat this last one. Cubes eaten equals 4, cubes remaining equals 0. Let's go on through the gate. And there we go. We have now we have properly set up a basic UI for tracking the progress of the player. Now, the last thing that I'm thinking we should do for this part of the tutorial is once again have a win condition. So remember when back in, I think, tutorial 1, it was either tutorial 1 or tutorial 2, when we had it be so that if the player ate the singular cheese cube in the level, because remember back in the day we only had 1 cheese cube, if the player ate the cheese cube here, then the scene would end and the scene would restart and you can continue making on new levels from there. Let's have it be now so that when the player goes through the gate, the scene ends. So let's do that. However, we do need to make a new script, so I'm going to actually first make a new game object. So let's go to 3D object and then cube, and this is going to be the trigger zone for when the player leaves the gate. Okay, so you're going to put it wherever the player leaves, and let's scale it so that the player cannot miss it. There we go. We'll make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so when the player enters this zone, the scene will end. Let's go into the inspector here. Let's disable the mesh renderer so that it doesn't show a giant cube. And in the box collider, let's set this to isTrigger. And let's change the name of this object to scene ender. There we go. And let's put this into other just for organization. And let's make a new script. So I'm going to call this script scene ender. And once again, you can call the script whatever you want. Let's click on the 3 dots and click on edit script. That will open up the new script. And we can actually copy the code from CheeseCube in this case, because we already have onTrigger enter collider other if other.compare tag player. Let's just copy this entire method and go into scene ender. Let's get rid of update and start, and also system collections. We don't need any of that. Let's paste the method here, and let's get rid of this stuff here because we don't need it. Okay, we now have our basic onTrigger enter with other compare tag. And remember, we need to add in using scene management when we are dealing with scenes. So we are going to say using Unity engine dot scene management. So now we can actually change up the scene. So we're going to say scene manager dot load scene. And once again, this could be whatever scene you want. I'm just going to have the scene restart, but if you want to change up the level or increment in level, then you can put in whatever scene the next level is in. Let's just see what scene we are dealing with here because I actually forgot. Okay, sample scene. That's going to be the name of it. Okay, sample scene. All right, this should work. Let's check out the script and see if it works. So I'm actually going to speed run this because you've seen this many, many times. So the gate has been opened, and there we go. The scene got restarted. And remember, as I said, you can do this for whatever scene you want. Okay, everybody, that is part 3 of the full-on beginner Unity tutorial series. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something useful out of it, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.